Welcome to the best of ForeFlight for pro pilots. This is a video we're doing that's essentially a discussion between me and two of our pilots who work at ForeFlight about some of the best and most recent features that we've introduced in 2020 and how those features can benefit owner-operators and other pro pilots as part of their flight planning and flying workflows. So besides me, Sam Taylor, the two pilots we have at the table here are Tom Gallagher. He is a CJ3 Plus pilot, and Josh Pava. He is a pilot of a Challenger 605 and 650. The way this is going to work is I'm going to demo some of these new features, just pull up my iPad and walk through how to use the features, where to find them, some of the different details with each one. And then I'll turn it over to Tom and Josh so they can speak about how they use these features as part of their own flying and share some of the insights that they've gained from using these features. So let's go ahead and get started. First up, we have 3D Preview. We first introduced 3D Preview last year, and we have expanded its functionality considerably this year with a number of major new enhancements that really broaden the applicability of this feature and make it very useful for different types of flight planning and looking at different pre-flight information. So to access 3D Preview, you start by putting in a route on the Maps view. You fill in all of the other information like the aircraft, the altitude, the estimated time of departure, all of that stuff. And then to access 3D Preview, you tap this button just to the left of the Pack button in the flight plan editor. It looks kind of like a globe with a little airplane symbol going around it. And this will open up 3D Preview. So a number of things that we've added to 3D Preview this year include this expandable route list, this waypoint list, and so you can expand and contract that. And you can tap on any of these waypoint names to jump directly to those waypoints in the route. And showing the waypoint names is another new feature that we added this year. So you can actually get a much better idea of where in the flight you are at each point. You'll also notice, if you look in the top left corner of the screen, that the time signature there, or the timestamp there, changes as I move between the waypoints. And that's because ForeFlight is calculating your expected crossing time at each of these waypoints and showing that expected time in the top left. So you're really getting not only a sense of where you are during the flight, but also what time it is once you get to that point. You can also tap the play button to play through the route, and you can tap the button to the right of it to switch between different playthrough speeds. Or if you want to very quickly jump to a certain point in the route without using these waypoints, you can just slide your finger along the bar at the bottom of the screen to quickly jump through the flight. As you can see, 3D Preview shows both terrain and aerial imagery. And so it's really giving you a realistic view of what your surroundings would look like during the flight. One other thing we introduced this year to 3D Preview is the ability to switch between these different camera modes. So by tapping those two airplane buttons in the bottom left, you can be in first-person mode, where you're looking essentially from the cockpit itself, and you can move around and look at different points. And then you tapping the button below that will take you into third-person mode, which is a view where you're seeing the airplane itself, and moving the camera will rotate it around the aircraft. And of course, you can zoom in and out to see it at different levels. Now, the most recent feature that we've introduced to 3D Preview are weather layers. So you can tap the layers button in the bottom left just above those two airplane buttons. And now you can see that you can select from 4 icing and turbulence layers. If you tap on one, you get this altitude slider on the right. And by default, it will follow your current altitude. So you can see at this point there is no icing at 30,000 feet. But if I drag that altitude slider down, we may get to a point where there's icing. There is no icing at this part of the route, apparently. That's what that's indicating. But if I go ahead and switch to a different weather layer, such as turbulence, now you can see that there is turbulence at this point. So it's within 3D preview, ForeFlight uses these colored blocks to indicate the presence of icing or turbulence at that location. So if I zoom a bit further out, you can see these a bit better. You can use the altitude slider to change the altitude of the blocks that you're viewing, or just tap that RTE button at the top, and it will immediately show the turbulence at your present altitude. So at this point of the flight, I'm at 43,000 feet, and so it is showing the icing forecast at that point. It's important to note that this is a forecast. It is not a live or a current reading.
It's a turbulence forecast, not icing forecast.
Oh, yeah. Thanks. Yep. So once you zoom inside the blocks, naturally, if they stayed solid, you wouldn't be able to see anything. And so in this case, the blocks actually become transparent besides the edges. So you can still see what the colors of the blocks are, and you can still see where they are, but you can also still see your aircraft and the terrain around your aircraft. So in this case, if you look in the top left again, you'll notice that we're experiencing moderate turbulence at this point. And that's indicated by this greenish yellow color. You'll notice that the very top of the route line that the aircraft is sort of skating on top of is also colored to match that moderate color. This is really useful because if you change the altitude, for example, if you want to see what the turbulence looks like further down, you're no longer looking at your present altitude, but the color of your route line indicates that there is still turbulence at that location. So this is a very handy way to view the relative severity of icing or turbulence at different altitudes at the same time. At once at your present altitude, but also at a second altitude in case you want to maybe evaluate changing altitudes at this point. So like you saw, you can switch between the US or the global versions of these two icing and turbulence layers. These are the exact same layers that you would see on the overhead map. And so the global version will be a little bit lower fidelity, but it's also global. And it tends to show more severe readings. The colors tend to be more extreme looking at a given point. But both of these, they're derived from different forecast models. And so they're not necessarily more or less accurate than each other. And so it's very helpful to have essentially two different opinions on what the forecast for the icing and turbulence might be, just so you can get a good idea of, in the places where they're green, then you can be a lot more certain that you're going to encounter something there. So right now I'm connected to the internet, and so I'm just downloading this data over the internet. But of course, if during a flight, you're not going to be connected. And so the way that you do that is you just use the pack feature, and pack will download those icing and turbulence layers to your device so they're available offline. And this applies, like I said, both for the overhead map version and also for the 3D version. So let me bring this up here. So here's the overhead version. Then if I go back into 3D, you'll see it's the same. Another thing to note about 3D, you get this very interesting view here when you're on the ground. Because I have RTE selected at the top of the altitude slider, it doesn't only show the turbulence at my current altitude, it actually shows the turbulence at any altitude I will cross through as part of my route. And so with some of the layers, when there's very heavy icing or turbulence present at your destination or your departure airport, you get this stair-step effect, where it's showing as you move through each altitude as you're climbing, and you can see the current altitude in the very top left of the screen. It's actually showing you that you're going to have turbulence all throughout your climb out. So this is an interesting perspective in the sense that it's really going to be showing you all of the altitudes that are relevant for a given flight.
What I would add here is, in our world of private aviation, when we're flying clients around, this gives us a good predictor. So in our pre-flight brief, we can be very specific about where we're going to possibly encounter turbulence. So you can brief the passengers in advance. That way, they won't be as stressed out about it. And also from the pilot perspective, obviously you can take this information to possibly plan your route around it and avoid some of it and mitigate as much as possible for the trip.
Yeah, that's a great point. This supplements obviously the layers on the overhead map, and so while the overhead map will show you a much broader geographic range, it will show you where turbulence is happening in a much larger range, but only at one altitude and at one time. Of course, if you move the timestamp, you can only see one forecast period at once. What 3D review is doing, or what 3D preview is doing, is supplementing that with a view that's more directly applicable to your current flight. So you're not having to move through those different forecast periods and guesstimate what's going to be active at your present time. And that's important because 3D preview actually combines all forecast periods that will be active during your flight. So you can see that this is a more than a 6-hour flight, even a 7-hour flight. And so this is something where there's not going to be only one forecast period that will be active for this entire thing. We're likely going to go through 2 or maybe even 3 different forecast periods. And that's important because if you look at the timestamp now, this is at 4:30 a.m. I probably could have planned this flight at a more reasonable time. But I can now use the time slider to move this forward to roughly that time. And so you can see that this would be the forecast period that would be showing when I'm viewing that flight in 3D preview. All right, so that's 3D review with weather. Tom and Josh, do you guys have anything to share on how you use this as part of your flight planning and some of the ways that you use it?
Why don't you go ahead first, Tom?
Okay. Yeah, for me, flying as a Part 91 pilot in the CJ3 Plus, a lot of times I'm flying to locations that I've never been to before, and 3D, all the features that have been rolled out with 3D and ForeFlight in the last year have been really, really useful for me. This time of the year, everyone's wanting to go to ski country, so this is a great way for you to get an idea of what you're going to experience in terms of terrain. You can get a look around the terrain of what you're going to experience coming inbound on the approach or outbound on the departure. So this gives you a little good peace of mind and a free look at what you're going to be experiencing in the aircraft. And it's really useful. One thing that I think is especially useful about the 3D features is just getting a look at the airport itself. So recently I flew into the Florida Keys for the first time, and at Marathon I was able to do the 3D image of the airport and then recognize the shape of the airport, the shape of the island, and know where the runway is. So you can use it to whatever your runway you're going in on. You can get a general look at the airport itself. And generally what I try to do, it's not perfect, but you can usually pick out 1 or 2 visual reference points that you can use if you're going into a new airport. Maybe the shape of the coastline, maybe a prominent road that can vector you in from there to find the airport if you're going somewhere new.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it's worth noting that this 3D airport, of course, this was the very first 3D feature that we introduced. And it doesn't display weather the way that 3D preview does. But as Tom was saying, it's incredibly useful if what you're really wanting to look at is the airport itself and the airport environment, so you can get a sense of what to expect as you're flying in there. Josh, how about you? Do you use this feature a lot?
Yeah, I do use it a fair amount. And much like Tom was saying, I think one of my favorite uses for the feature is knowing, the arrival, the departure, approaches, what they look like relative to terrain. What am I going to be flying over on the way in? Finding the airport, it's very useful. And post-flight as well, it's quite handy to be able to look back at past track logs and pull up the 3D view. And it really was at that point that I realized how useful this feature is, because I'm able to use a 3D preview for a route and literally recognize where I'm at along the route. If I'm flying a 300-mile trip along the coast, I don't need to look at a chart, to see, well, is that Santa Barbara or not, as long as I recognize it, in the 3D preview. So it's extremely reliable and provides a really good imaging, for what the route looks like and where I just flew in case of a past flight review.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. The distinction between 3D preview and 3D review, it's not just the fact that one has a P and one doesn't. The difference is that 3D review is you're reviewing a past flight that you've recorded with a track log. And so you can pull up a track log, go ahead and hit the 3D button, and now you can follow that flight. The key difference here is that, of course, when you're following a flight, you're not going to have any forecast layers to view, and we don't record the waypoints themselves, but you are able to see what your actual speed was. In this case, I think this was a simulated flight, which is why it's behaving somewhat erratically. But as you can see, there's a holding pattern there. So if you've previously flown a flight and recorded it with a track log and you want to go back and check it out, maybe review it, look at some of your maneuvers, this is a really great debriefing tool to look at a past flight.
Yeah, and it's also handy on a past flight if you were in IMC and you want to see, what did I fly over? What did it look like on that approach? So I think there's some cases where that's a pretty handy to be able to look back on and see what it looked like, what you weren't able to see, to become a little more familiar with the area.
Yeah, another great point.
A last point that I'll make is, whenever I get a flight to a new location, I might reach out to some of my pilot buddies and say, hey, have you ever flown here? How is it? And pick their brain for what I can expect. And a lot of times as pilots, we'll just kind of tell each other, oh, it's no sweat, no problem, and that's maybe all you'll get from it. Yeah, you'll be fine. But with 3D preview, you can actually kind of, for yourself, really give it a thorough pre-flight, a thorough look, and pick out a couple learning points for yourself, emphasis points that you can bring with you to the flight. And that even being able to pull one or two things out of that is really valuable for you as a pilot.
Yeah, and one other aspect of 3D preview that I haven't discussed yet is if you add an approach to your route on the map, it will actually show not only the waypoints of the route, not only the regular waypoints, but the approach fixes, and it will include these speed and altitude restrictions as part of the labels for those fixes. And so this is a really great way to preview not only the weather along your route, but also the actual approach that you may end up taking as you're flying into the airport. And of course, this is something that as long as you have all of your regular data downloads completed, just the standard downloads you would do, this is something that you can preview as soon as you get assigned an approach. As you're getting towards your destination, you could quickly pull up 3D preview, plug in the approach, open up 3D preview, and then you can see exactly what that approach is going to look like with those altitudes built in. So just as a reminder, this feature is available with ForeFlight Performance, Performance Plus, and Business Performance. And as well as this, all of these, the 3D preview with approaches, 3D review, 3D airports. The one other new place that we've added some of these weather layers is in profile view. So if you open up profile after you've planned your route, you can see that we have these same weather selectors here. And in this case, you can actually select two at a time. So now we're seeing where the icing was along the route. There really wasn't very much of it. But this is just yet another perspective that you can get on a planned flight in terms of, in this case, you're seeing all of the altitudes at once and the turbulence and icing that will be occurring at those altitudes along your flight path. Do you guys tend to look at both the weather in profile view and the weather in 3D preview, or do you tend to gravitate to one or the other?
For me, it would be a quick look at the profile view, just to see if I'm going to encounter it.
Yeah, and I'm more actually just using the aeronautical map and using the altitude slider as appropriate. The airplane I fly doesn't. We do a fair amount of step climbs, but we're typically at one consistent altitude. And I find that to be, for me, the easiest way to absorb that information.
Yeah, that's a great point. That I guess the value of profile with the weather is really just if you find a very bad patch of turbulence like this here, you might want to know, well, can I simply descend a few thousand feet and get past it, or does it extend much further down? And so I'd have to really reroute around it. But if you're just going to be flying at the same altitude the whole time, as long as you don't encounter some of these pretty deep pockets of turbulence, then you can tend to rely more just on the overhead map. But again, the benefit of this is that it gives you so many different options of how to view this. You've got the overhead map, the profile view, and then also the 3D preview. So you're not going to be running out of ways to look at the weather, the icing and turbulence that may be impacting your next flight. All right, so from there, let's go ahead and move on to our next topic, which is internet traffic. So to view internet traffic, you just open up the layer selector and you have this traffic layer. And this is, it looks exactly the same as what you'd see if you were connected to an ADS-B device like Sentry or Stratus. It just says traffic. But if you're not connected to one of those devices, if you're connected to the internet, then what you'll see is internet traffic. So this traffic is fed into ForeFlight from FlightAware's traffic API. And so we are getting pretty much the entire stream of global internet traffic from FlightAware coming into ForeFlight at once. And so it's not just over the US, it's really anywhere where FlightAware is getting traffic, ForeFlight will also get it. Now, normally, if we were to show all traffic above the US, you would hardly be able to see the ground during the day. And so right now we filter the traffic that's shown at different altitudes. So in this case, all of these traffic targets are flying at a very high altitude, above 38,000 feet, I believe. So these are all the commercial airlines. And you can tap on any of the targets to see more information. And so it shows you the call sign or tail number, shows you the planned altitude, the location, the speed. It will interpret the call sign and show you the full call sign. So in this case, it's Delta Airlines. If they filed a flight plan, it will also show you the departure and destination airport and the filed ETA. And this is significant because this isn't necessarily the actual ETA. If the flight went much faster than they had filed it for, then they could be arriving at a different time than what's shown here. This is just based on the filed ETA. And it will also show some other information such as the aircraft type, and finally how long ago this position report was received from FlightAware. And so of course these positions are not continuously updated. They are we receive new position reports at different frequencies, sometimes every 5 seconds, sometimes it can be as much as every 20 seconds or 30. But we interpolate the movement of these aircraft based on those position reports. So you get the impression of continuous movement, even though the position reports are only coming once every 20 or 30 seconds. Now, as you zoom into the map, ForeFlight begins to show traffic at lower and lower altitudes. And so you can start zooming into airports and seeing more information about them without having to tap on them, but you're also seeing the aircraft at even lower altitudes. And so in this case, you're even seeing aircraft that are very, very close to the ground. And as you continue to zoom in, we will also show ground traffic. And depending on the airport, depending on what capabilities it has in terms of on-field monitoring and things, we may or may not show ground traffic. In this case, you can see there is. So you can tap on it to see more information about it. Ground traffic is always depicted as these brown traffic icons rather than the blue of the airborne ones. One other significant feature with this is the ability to search for traffic anywhere in the world. And so it's not simply if you want to find a particular aircraft that you know is on a flight, you can actually tap in the search bar and you can start to type the tail number or the call sign of an aircraft, and it will immediately start showing you results based on that. So if you tap on these, it'll jump right to where they are. And in this case, I searched for something very general, obviously, like just some Southwest aircraft. And so it's prioritizing the aircraft that are very close to me. But if you know what the exact tail number is, you can just type that in. And if that aircraft is within FlightAware's system, if it has a known position, whether it's on the ground like this one or in the air, then ForeFlight will immediately take you to that position. So really powerful feature in terms of just seeing what activity is going on, especially in terms of planning your arrival into an airport. You can see what arrivals are in use. Or for example, if you're planning to go out for a flight, you can see where practice is taking place, for example. Here you can see lots of touch and goes going on. So it's just really handy for being able to see what's going on before you actually get up into the sky. What do you guys think about this feature?
So one of the things that I find most useful for the internet traffic feature is actually to employ some of the overlays that we have on the aeronautical map, or Jeppesen en route if you prefer. Mm-hmm. And by doing so, we can see that the airways that aircraft are using. We can overlay a arrival chart. I'll just give you a second so you can pull that up.
Yeah. So here I've gone ahead and plugged in this short little route, and I've added an arrival procedure to it. So something that you can do with internet traffic is you can see, well, what arrival is actually being used in this case. And so I can go ahead and turn on the traffic layer, and I can see that there are definitely aircraft that are flying along the same arrival. And I can even go further and stack the Jeppesen plate, the Jeppesen arrival plate on top. And you can confirm that this is the arrival that's being given by ATC. Tom, did you want to say something about how you use internet traffic in this way?
Yeah, so this is a great little feature where you can confirm before you get in the air, at least have a good sense of what you can expect after takeoff. So in this case, we're able to build this route from the suggested routes in ForeFlight, where we get the rnet.cver4. And then while still on the ground, we can put up all these layers and see that the traffic is actually going that way. We've all been there when approach will give us a route change. And this way we can at least have a sense that what we filed for is likely what we can expect based on the traffic we're seeing. That way, before we take off, we have a good sense that we won't have to make any fast and furious changes at the end of the flight.
All right. So now we're going to go ahead and move on to our next feature, which is a new navlog template that we recently introduced. So I'm going to go ahead and send this flight to the flights view. This will enable me to do additional planning with it. Of course, if I have a ForeFlight Performance subscription, I can do things like specify the fuel policy, get very, very detailed with my fuel and weight planning, just to make sure I'm getting those very accurate performance calculations. And if I then open up the navlog, in the very top right corner, you've got this gear button, the settings button, and this allows you to change the template used for the navlog. And the one that we've had for a long time is the standard template. And this is one where all of the information is rather dense, but it allows you to have all of this information in a very easy to read format. What we introduced at the request of many of our customers was an alternate format, which here it's called international, but there isn't anything that is that requires you to use it only for international flights. Really, the benefit of this is that there's a lot more room to use in terms of jotting down notes and remarks and things. Josh, did you want to say something about how you use this Navlog template?
Yeah, sure. So this is the format that I tend to fly in, and like Sam had mentioned, probably the item that I like the most about all this is the room that we have to write. I think it's a little bit more orderly how I normally conduct a flight, meaning we write the departure ATIS, then we write the clearance. On the bottom of the route string, we have the arrival ATIS. For those of us that track block on, block off, on off times, in out times, we have those sections on the top. So this is a Navlog that was designed more for the jet pilot, more the things that we're interested in keeping records of for the flight. For those that do over water flights, we also have added a little bit of room to notate items such as the fuel used, actual time of arrival, estimated time of arrival, etc. for each waypoint, along with some remarks which may be frequencies or anything else that's pertinent to each waypoint. So, like I said, it's the Navlog that I prefer to fly in, and I think it provides a lot of information at a quick glance.
Yeah, exactly. And our Navlogs have always been printable, but this is one where we really took into account and designed it in a way that makes it very much optimized for printing out and marking it up. You can also save it to ForeFlight documents if you wanted to, rather than printing it. If you wanted to simply mark it up within the documents view, you can send it here and actually annotate it within documents. And this alternate format, the international format, this is also included in ForeFlight's Performance Plus and Business Performance subscription plans. So moving on to our next feature, we have arrival time planning on the flights view. This is a relatively simple feature that actually opens up a lot of flexibility in terms of flight planning and helps you save time when you're trying to calculate the right departure time that you need to use. So you can see that you have just under the departure and destination section, you have an ETD and an ETA switch. So what this means is that in ETD mode, you can tap on the time and you're setting the actual departure time that will be used. Whereas in ETA mode, it turns things around. And so now you're not selecting a departure time, but rather the time that you want to arrive. So in this case, if I want to arrive at 8:45 p.m., I can just set that and it will calculate what departure time is needed based on my aircraft's performance and all of the information I've already entered in order to arrive at that time. And so you can now see what the departure time is by looking at the very top of the screen underneath the departure and destination airport up there. You can see it says there's a departure time of 8 p.m. Central Time. One other thing we added is the ability to quickly increment this time by different intervals. So you can see you've got these -30, +30, +1 hour buttons, and the now button, which will immediately jump you to the present time. This is really useful if you had planned and filed a flight for a certain time, but there was a brief delay and you needed to push it back by 30 minutes. You could just tap that button and it will automatically add that time without you having to scroll through these number wheels. So do either of you, Tom and Josh, tend to use, which of these planning modes do you tend to prefer when you're planning a flight?
So typically I would do the ETD, but this new feature kind of resonated with me as a private pilot, because a lot of times what we're doing is we're bringing a client to an event, and a lot of times our clients need a little direction. Their schedule can be flexible. So this gives you an easy way to say, all right, we need to be wheels up by this time to get you to the destination for your event. So, a lot of times we know we have clients who maybe are a little uncertain about what time they want to get to the airport. This way, you've got a quick way to give them kind of a hard time of, we need to leave before this time to get you there by this time. As pilots, we can also use it maybe if we have a commercial flight that we have to catch, and we can say, hey, we need to be on deck at this time so that we can make this day work. And it's just a good way to get a little data to give to the customer, to give them a little guidance sometimes when they need it on what time we need to leave.
Yeah, and I also think for those trips that require fuel stops, it's particularly handy. If you know you want to be in, say, San Francisco at 7 p.m., but you're leaving Chicago and you need to make a fuel stop, you can work backwards and plan your arrival for 7 p.m. and then plan both your first leg and your second leg to figure out when you need to leave your departure point to arrive at your destination at 7 p.m.
Exactly. It just really opens up a huge amount of flexibility in terms of not having to crunch those numbers in your head to say, well, I have to give 30 minutes for the fuel stop, and then maybe the drive is going to take 10 minutes just to get to the airport. So how do I need to factor all that stuff in? If you can just put in what time you need to arrive, then it'll give you the time you need to be wheels up, and then you can just add some buffer time, whatever you feel comfortable adding. And then you've got that information handy. And this feature, the ETA selector, this is also a Performance Plus feature. The time increments are available for everyone, but the ETA selector in particular is available with Performance. All right, so moving on to our next feature, we have iOS multitasking and a number of major design improvements that we've made to the ForeFlight interface. This is something we did sometime, I think, June or maybe May of 2020, and it really increased the flexibility of the app, both in terms of being able to use ForeFlight side by side with other apps, as well as really rearranging some of the design elements within the app to improve how you use it, both on iPad and especially on iPhone. So let's go ahead and start just by showing the multitasking capability. In order to use multitasking, you need to be using it with two apps that support multitasking. So of course, ForeFlight now does support multitasking, but the other app that you use it with also needs to support multitasking in order to truly use them side by side. So some apps do support it, some apps don't. Essentially all of Apple's own apps at this point support multitasking. So we'll go ahead and show it using the Notes app. Which would be a useful way to, for example, quickly jot down in-flight notes, even as you have ForeFlight up and you're following along with the flight. So in order to use it, you just swipe up from the bottom of the screen only about an inch, not very far. If you swipe up too hard, then you'll, of course, go to the home screen. But if you swipe up just about an inch, it brings up your tab bar. And now, if I want to open one of these apps in split screen with ForeFlight, you just tap hold on it and you drag it to the side of the screen. And you can see that the ForeFlight app moves over a bit, which indicates that this app does support multitasking. And so once I release it, now I have the Notes app opened alongside the ForeFlight app. You can click and hold in the middle of the screen and divider between them to resize each of them. And ForeFlight can now be used whether you want to use it in this configuration where you have ForeFlight is taking up 2/3 of the screen and the Notes app is only taking up 1/3, or you can change it so that now ForeFlight is only taking up a much smaller amount of the screen and the Notes app is taking up more. So it gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of choosing which app you want to give more screen real estate to versus the other one. So one of the big benefits of multitasking compared to how things were before when ForeFlight did not support multitasking is if you need to use another app, such as the Notes app or the Apple Maps app or just any other app that you need to use, especially if you need to use it for more than a few seconds at a time, when you put ForeFlight into split screen with another app, it ensures that if you're recording a track log, whether from Sentry or from the built-in GPS, ForeFlight will not stop recording that track log while it's in split screen. And so as opposed to what may happen if you're using it with an app that doesn't support split screen, where once ForeFlight goes into the background for a minute or more at a time, it can sometimes interrupt that track log and you end up with 2 track logs for one flight. So one of the benefits of split screen, if you're using it with an app that supports it, is you can put them side by side, and this ensures that that track log will be maintained and continue recording even as you're interacting with a different app.
Yeah, absolutely, Sam. And one thing to keep in mind as well is the logbook entries will also be from your departure point to your destination, rather than potentially, if it stops tracking, where you'll end up with 2 logbook entries for a single flight.
Exactly. Yeah, that's one of the frustrations that people have with when you have a case of a track log that stopped recording. Once you auto-generate a logbook entry from that track log, it generally will not, it'll be from an airport to some latitude, longitude point, which is where the track log stopped recording. So as you said, this is a great example of how you can just make things a bit more efficient and cut down on some extra work that you'd have to put in to rectify that issue with the split track log. So I'm going to go ahead now and get this out of split screen. And to do that, you just tap hold in the middle again, and you drag it all the way to the side. And now we're back in full screen with ForeFlight. So in conjunction with that split screen feature, which by the way is only supported on iPad, you cannot do multitasking on iPhone. At the same time as we enabled support for that, we also made some major changes and improvements to ForeFlight's UI. So for example, the biggest change is when you tap on More, rather than a dedicated page, More is now a tab that slides in from the right. And you still have access to all of the same tabs that you had before from the More page, but now essentially you can just access these at any time rather than having to go to a separate page to do so. You can see that the downloads and the settings are available at the top of this view. And rather than opening in a larger page, they simply open as these floating windows on the screen. And you can get out of them either by tapping the close button or just by swiping down from the top, which is a common gesture you can use in different iOS apps. One of the biggest capabilities we added here, which has been requested for a long time, and people were very excited to see us do this, is we added the ability to rearrange the tab bar. So now, rather than having to use the tab order that we think is best, you can actually go in here and rearrange many of these, all of them in fact. And so you can set it up in whatever way you find to be most useful. Tap the Save button, and now if you look at the bottom of the screen, you'll see that those tabs have been rearranged. And so this order is totally up to you. You can move them around as much as you want. You can set them up differently on different devices. In fact, this isn't something that is shared between your devices. So you could set up your iPad one way, and you could set up your iPhone a completely different way based on how you use each of those devices. So once you've rearranged the tab bar, if you want to get things back to the way they were, you just tap Reset to Default Order, and now everything is reset to the original order. One other thing to note with this new capability is just to the left of the More tab, you have, right now it says Logbook, but this is actually a tab that will change depending on the last tab that you viewed from the More menu. So for example, if I open up Custom Content, you can see that Custom Content tab is now selected. But if I jump back to Maps, it still says Custom Content. So this is a way that you can quickly jump back and forth between your main tabs, which is everything from airports to checklist, everything to the left of this little vertical bar at the bottom of the screen. You can quickly jump between those and the last tab that you used from the More menu. This is really important because if you're frequently making changes, for example, if you're in Logbook, you're working on a flight and you want to quickly jump back and forth between the flight plan, for example, and the Logbook entry, you can very easily do that now without opening the More menu to get back there. So this is something we're calling the Dynamic tab, and it just makes it very easy to switch back and forth between your most recently used tab. So the one other major feature to note that we introduced recently is the multi-mode timer. And this is something that you can see at the very bottom of the More menu. And it's always available right there at the bottom. It'll even cover up some of the other tabs, especially if you're using an iPhone. You'll find that More timer is, or the multi-mode timer in More is taking up a fair bit of space, but it just ensures that it's always accessible. And we call it the multi-mode timer because it has two different modes. Right now, it's in count up mode. So you just tap on it and it starts counting up. So this is an easy way just to gauge how much time has passed during different activities. Like if you're going to be in a hold for a certain amount of time, you can just gauge how long you've been in that hold using this. You tap it to stop and zero it. And then if you tap the arrow button, it'll switch modes. And now it is in a countdown mode. And in this case, you tap on it and you can set the length of time that timer will be active. You can set it to repeat more than once, and you can set the number of repetitions. So in this case, maybe I want it to repeat 4 times. And now once you tap it, it'll just start counting down. And when it reaches 0, it will give you a notification within the app that the timer has stopped, or rather that the timer has reached 0 and that it will repeat. And if you're not in ForeFlight, if ForeFlight is backgrounded or even closed, it'll still give you an iOS notification each time this timer reaches 0. So this is really handy for tracking things such as making sure you're balancing your fuel usage out of each of your fuel tanks, and just anything else that requires a countdown timer, especially one that needs to repeat a certain number of times.
Yeah, and for those that fly with ForeFlight on a yoke mount, this is also pretty handy for an instrument approach if you're timing between fixes. It's pretty handy to have all that right there essentially within your eyesight.
Exactly, and being able to see it simply by opening the More menu ensures that it's always accessible whenever you need to take a quick look at it. So with that, that rounds out all of the features that we were going to cover today. I hope everyone who is watching learned something new about one or maybe all of these different features. Of course, if you want to learn more about the features in ForeFlight and see what else we've released in the past year, you can easily do that by going to foreflight.com/releases. That's where we keep track of all of our major app releases, and we provide links to view more details about all of those features. So if you're not so sure what we've done in the past year, we've done quite a lot. And if you're wanting to get more details about them, just go to that URL and you can learn about every single one. We also have lots of feature tutorials you can watch at foreflight.com/videos. And of course, we have our On Frequency webinar series, which you can register for upcoming webinars by going to foreflight.com/onfrequency. And you can contact our support team at team@foreflight.com and our sales team at sales@foreflight.com, especially if you're part of a multi-pilot operation. They can give you a demo and get you set up with ForeFlight. So thank you so much, Tom and Josh. This has been a great presentation of some of these features, and we hope you enjoyed it. All right, so we do have some questions that came in that we'll go ahead and take a couple minutes to respond to now. So first question, any plans to allow text entry on the ForeFlight mobile navlog so that we can really go paperless? Josh, do you want to answer that one?
Sure, Sam. So, as was mentioned, I actively fly Bombardier Challenger, and I've pretty much been paperless using ForeFlight Mobile for well over a year now, and that includes the oceanic flights. And we showed it pretty briefly in the webinar, but what you can do is you can go to the flights tab and open up a flight that you're wanting to essentially annotate. Open up the navlog, and from there use the Send To icon in the upper right-hand corner and choose Save to ForeFlight Documents. What that will do is it populates a PDF within your Documents tab on the bottom of the iPad screen. You can then go to the Imported drive on the left-hand side and open up the nav log that you just sent over. And from there, you're able to click the pencil icon on the top of the screen, and you can draw shapes if you're going oceanic and you want to do your circles and crosses and check marks. You can press the T button to insert text. Essentially, you can annotate using highlighting, texting, drawing shapes, or just free text with an Apple Pencil, for example. And once you're done with that, you then have that on your iPad uh, that's essentially preserved. What I like to do at the end of that, once I'm done annotating, is send it to a flight, which will then allow me to open up that flight and find the annotated nav log in the file section of the flight. So that's allowed me to go paperless for quite some time now. And I think if others give it a try, you'll probably have equal success with it.
Yeah, great answer. Next up, is there a recommended hardware version that ForeFlight would recommend to effortlessly run all of these new features? So the answer is that any iPad that can run iOS 13 can run the most recent ForeFlight version. That's the minimum iOS that's required for the most recent version. But of course, as usual, the rule is the more recent the device is, the more smoothly it's going to run, the faster it's going to run, and over time, devices will gradually become slower. So if you're buying a new device this year, you could definitely get any of the new iPads that came out this year, or one of the most popular iPads is the iPad Mini 5. I believe that was introduced in either 2018 or 2019. So compared with previous iPad minis, it's very fast and it will certainly be supported for years to come. But just as a rule, as long as the device can upgrade to iOS 13 or later, then it's good to go. Someone asked, where do I go to select 3D? So there isn't any one answer to that because there's actually multiple different types of 3D capabilities, as you saw in the video. If you're looking at information for a given airport, you can tap the 3D button. And in most cases now, the 3D button looks kind of like a sort of like a globe with an aircraft flying around it. So anytime you see that button, it means you can access the 3D feature. But you can do it from airports to get to 3D airports. You can do it from the FPL in the FPL window, and that will give you 3D preview, so you can look at the weather and along your route and all the terrain and everything. And then, of course, if you're viewing a track log, you can access 3D there, and that will give you 3D review, where you can actually play back a previously recorded flight and see all the maneuvers you made during that. So those are the three different flavors of 3D that ForeFlight has, and so there are many different places where you can access them. Next up, how do I turn on track log? So by default, ForeFlight will have, if you're looking at the maps view, if you look in the bottom left corner just above the zoom in and zoom out buttons, there's a button that says rec, R-E-C, and that's for record, of course. And so if you tap that, you can manually start and stop a track log recording. But another way that you can record track logs, which it's not enabled, it is enabled by default, but after your very first flight, it'll ask you if you want to enable or disable it, is the auto start stop feature. And so that's a feature where ForeFlight will automatically detect a takeoff and a landing, and it will start and stop the track log based on those. And so that's a nifty way to record your track logs without having to remember to push that record button every single time. So you can find that setting in more settings. If you just scroll down, the name of the setting is enable auto start stop. Next up, any suggestions on how to better use the flight planning and filing features for two crew operations? Josh, do you want to also handle that one?
Yeah, sure. This is something I can really relate to because every flight I do is with two crew. So in ForeFlight Mobile, when you are creating a flight or filing a flight is probably even a better way to go, is when you press the proceed to file button, towards the bottom of that form, there's an email field under the pilot heading. And in that email field, you are able to enter multiple pilot email addresses separated by a comma. So put one valid address, comma, the next valid address, and now all filing notifications, expected route, if there is one for that flight, um, the general briefing that we send in the beginning, just a general overview, all that goes to both of the pilots, or for that matter, if you have a third person or second person who just was interested in your filing, it goes to any email address that's listed there. So that's quite handy from a CRM standpoint in keeping the crew in the loop about what's been filed, the airports you're going between, etc. Um, in the cockpit, if you are running ForeFlight Mobile on two iPads, you can do cockpit sharing, which is enabled in the More menu than Settings, and by simply toggling cockpit sharing on. And again, that's just with a blue field showing to the right on the button. And what that will allow you to do is where I find it most useful is going in the FPL from the maps page, pressing the send to icon, and then choosing Josh's iPad or Josh's iPhone. That will at least equal, so we're both on an equal footing as far as the route is concerned, because you're able to share that route between the iOS devices in the cockpit. Some other things that you can do also from the flights page is go to the flights and choose the send to icon and choose share flight. Whether you can share it through an iMessage or an email address, that will send a link to the recipient that allows them to open that flight in ForeFlight Mobile and see basically the same thing that you're seeing in your flights tab, with the exception of their version will be read only. So they won't be able to make any changes to that, but they'll be able to see everything that you've entered. And sort of feature that I use somewhat regularly as well is going to the send to icon and pressing share PDF. Once you share PDF, and again, same way as you did previously, what that will allow you to do is it sends a PDF either in the flight or in the document section um, of the flight. So, or excuse me, ForeFlight Mobile, and then you will be able to have a nav log, and in some cases, perhaps a flight plan form if you have that enabled. So there's some great ways to share your flights within ForeFlight Mobile with multiple pilots that I think will probably be proven pretty useful. And that's what I've got on that, Sam.
Yeah, great explanation, Josh. Just as a general note, anytime you see a send to button or the share button, it just looks like a vertical arrow coming out of a box. Just tap on that wherever you see it and see what the options are, because there are a lot of really useful functions you can access through that button. One thing to note also is that cockpit sharing requires the devices to be on the same Wi-Fi network. And so if you're not on the same Wi-Fi network, you can't share to nearby devices, but that's one of the great features that some of our ADS-B devices like Sentry or Stratus have, which is that since they connect via Wi-Fi, if two people are connected, or if two devices are connected to the same Sentry device or some other ADS-B Wi-Fi device, then they'll be able to cockpit share through that device. So that's a nice little benefit of using some of those in-flight devices. Next question, just a couple more here. Can we use the Navlog with the Business Pro subscription? The answer is yes. The Navlog is available with Business Pro. However, it is missing some of the details that it would have with Business Performance. And those are details that are going to be related to the aircraft's performance, the detailed weight breakdown that you get with Performance, the detailed fuel breakdown that you get. So the Navlog is there. It does give you the list of waypoints. It does give you some basic information about the flight, but overall, having the business performance plan is what will give you the most use out of the Navlog. Not to mention the fact that with business performance, you can switch to the international Navlog template, which can really be used with any sort of flight, but it offers more room for jotting down notes, kind of like what Josh was saying about annotating his Navlogs. So he would use the international Navlog for that. and that navlog template is only available with business performance. All right, last question here. Are there any future developments for having radar in 3D? Nothing that we can share right now. If you've been paying attention to our recent releases, you'll have seen that we have been adding additional weather features in 3D, though as of right now, all of those are simply forecast weather layers. So you've got forecast icing, forecast turbulence, and forecast cloud coverage, but none of them are live, uh, any kind of live weather indication the way that radar would be. So nothing to say on that right now, but that's a nice feature request, and we'll pass that along to the team. So thanks everyone for attending. Thanks Josh, thanks Tom for helping out. And if anyone is planning to attend, or if you're not registered to attend the ForeFlight Founders Happy Hour later this afternoon in an hour and a half, I believe, you can register for that at foreflight.com/NBAA. I highly recommend you register for that if you're interested in hearing some of the kind of behind the scenes information about what's going on at ForeFlight, and just some of our company founders' thoughts on the year and on what's coming in the future. So feel free to register for that if you haven't. If you are registered, we hope to see you there. And thanks again, everyone, for watching.